Hello, this is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind, and we are fortunate today to have the great environmentalist Terrell Erickson here to guide us about her and guide us and tell us about her environmental work and actually a legacy of a lifetime of environmental work. So we're very fortunate today. Welcome, Terrell.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. And so let me open up because I know that you grew up in Buffalo in Montana. And was there anything about your youth that led you to this love of the environment? And we'll get into the wetlands later. But what shaped you? And did you go to college in the Midwest? Those sort of questions. So because this is actually the show is called Journeys of the Mind, so we have to begin with your opening journey.
Yeah, I think opening journeys are really important, and they're kind of set you on your pace in life and your passions in life. And so yes, I actually was born in Buffalo, New York. At the age of 3, the whole family moved to Missoula, Montana, where my father got a job in the chemistry department at the university teaching organic chem, and later went on to start the environmental studies program at the University of Montana. But yeah, so Montana was important, and I was fortunate enough to move up a canyon and live in basically in the woods. And so every summer in the woods, learning plants and animals and running, you know, running free. Very exciting. And the other, I think, moment of revelation was when I went to 2 summers when I was 12 and 13 at the Yellow Bay Biological Station on Flathead Lake, which is basically a camp from the University of Montana, where my dad was teaching. And we got to do a lot of field work and a lot of field investigation of science. And I'll never forget a marsh walk that we had. We were looking at red-winged blackbird territories or some such thing. I was 12. And Dad was in front of me. We were just in sneakers and, shorts walking through the marsh. And I saw this round thing in the water, and then I saw on the backs of his legs some really creepy stuff. So there were leeches in this. So I started like hopping up and down. It's crazy. And Dad, and he was like very calm. He said, "The bank is right over there. We're going to get out, pull them off. This is the deal." And so that was my first, I guess, hook into wetlands when I was 12. And from then on, I just really enjoyed the environment and thinking about the needs of the environment and of people who, need clean water, need clean air. And I think that was kind of a beginning. And I went to the University of Washington for my undergrad, and really, especially, I liked the liberal arts a bit more. So I had a poli-sci degree with economics flair to it. I went to University of London for economics work, and then came back and didn't know quite what to do, but saw that there was an internship in the state legislature in Washington State in Olympia in the Environmental Affairs Committee. And so I interned and met my mentor there. And she was a mathematician by trade and said, "Terrell, it's all good about environmental law and policy and all that, but you need a science base in order to not only create, but also implement environmental policies well." And so I went back to school. And I went back and I got a limnology emphasis degree, which is freshwater, did a water quality study of a lake there in Washington. And, from then on, it kind of spiraled in terms of finding details and internships. And I got a governor's fellowship to work at the Utilities and Transportation Commission, which sets rates for people And in that, some of the laws that were occurring at the time, the Safe Drinking Water Act and all of that, to work with, private utilities and companies about the act. And so a lot of it seems not fragmented because there was still meaning. I wanted to learn. What kinds of, what would be my real passions, and what kind of good I could do, what kind of service I could do, in terms of the environment. So after graduate school, I joined the Department of Ecology there in Washington State and worked in their wetlands section, the coastal zone management wetlands section, and met my future husband, who we were together with for 11 years, and he was the one who brought me to Guam. So he joined the military. He was Civil Engineer Corps, and we moved to Guam from Washington State, and I loved it. I absolutely love the islands. It's remarkable, all of the islands generally, but I think Guam, taught us a lot about. Well, we dove every weekend we possibly could. So I took ichthyology to learn to fish. The reefs are still really delightful. The island of Palau, which is close by, we would go dive trips to and enjoy. I later got to work in Palau. But generally, there in Guam I worked for a private consultant for a little bit, but then my first federal job was with the U.S. Navy. I was the natural resources manager of a base there and helped them with all sorts of compliance issues that were occurring at the time. And so help them comply and get into shape and do some restoration work and all of that kind of thing.
Before you move on on that story, what does it mean to be working? But there's such a big controversy right now with the Navy and its storage of materials that's so damaging to the water system here in Hawaii. So what was it like? Tell us about that experience, because I think that's absolutely fascinating. Because you were the resource person, and you were not a Navy person, right? I mean, you were a civilian.
Well, okay. So my very first day on the job, there was a secret, unknown to us, inspection by U.S. EPA Region 9, which is California, San Francisco, came out to Guam and said, we want you to open your books, we want you to open your warehouses, your fuel farm, and we're going to inspect you. And so the captain, of course, of the base is shaking in his shoes. And at the end of the day, this is my first day of the job. At the end of the day, they sat around us, and these are two women, very professional, really went through everything. And at the end of the day, we had 17 notices of violation from EPA that we needed to either clean up or we were going to have millions of dollars of fines. And so things that were pretty simple, and you think about Guam too, World War II, a lot of these facilities were World War II, including the fuel farm, and so not to blame the Navy per se, but they got on it soon after, and I was a part of a lot of that, is getting things ready, getting more inspections for haz waste in particular, a lot of water issues, fuel farm issues, no spill retention plans, those kinds of things, which I helped them with. Yeah, and this was all before Hawaii, so I learned a lot in that year and a half. It was just a year and a half. But it shaped me too, to also think I wanted to do more natural resources work than hazardous waste and the CERCLA and all of that kind of work. I found that much more gratifying and something that I could do better.
when you talk about restoration, what do you mean by that in terms of Guam? What did you do in terms of restoration?
Well, for instance, we had a Safe Drinking Water Act, well, a Clean Water Act violation in the fuel farm, and it had been leaking for a long time. It was a vent; it had been leaking, and so we had to remove all the soil, all the contaminated soil that was entering Sasso River. And so remove the soil, put it in a safe soil burn place, and then work on monitoring. So I did all the monitoring and reporting to Guam EPA. And that kind of restoration work we did. I set some plans too they had some endangered species, endangered moorhen, similar to, not, it's a different species than here in Hawaii, but so there was some restoration planning to be done there in what kind of habitat needs are needed, and then how to keep out the brown tree snakes, and that kind of element that's not so dissimilar to Hawaii, although we don't have the snakes.
It sounds like you had your experience. Oh yeah, thank God for no snakes. But you had the Red Hill before the Red Hill, so that's really quite interesting, and will be interesting to everyone who watches this show. Now you made a transition after Guam and Palau, and I wonder if that transition was at some point to Washington D.C. because I noticed from your resume that you spent a great deal of time in Washington D.C. And what jobs did you have there? And then it's a separate issue. I'm going to ask you about New England in just a moment.
So before DC was Hawaii, and so my experiences in Hawaii included where I went for Clean Water Act, the Army Corps of Engineers. I worked for 3 years doing permitting work. Mostly, a lot of my wetlands work for Hawaii came from that. And then I met the soil scientist of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and he encouraged me to apply for the state biology job, which I worked 9 years in Hawaii before DC. And so my work in Hawaii, I think, was special. And I was always encouraged, because we are so unique in Hawaii, to be a representative of the states, of a unique state on the national level. And so I caught the eye of the national biologist who was in DC at the time, and he said, Terrell, you got to come to DC. So that was the breaker there.
Let me interrupt you because I must have missed the state biology job for 9 years in Hawaii. What was that job like, and what were the key issues that you faced? And did you? I guess part of this is, did you become sort of imbued with the Hawaiian cultural notions of land and water? And, as, for example, our big water environmentalist, the Rapun family over on the windward side has. But, what was that like?
I think it was one of the most, and it was a fun job too. So I joined as kind of a wetlands person, but that was 1996. And it was a new farm bill. And the farm bill is what really much runs the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's, a part of it, the conservation title of it, is to give money for conservation work to private lands, farmers and ranchers in particular. And so my job really was first, okay, I'm going to come in and help them with wetland compliance and wetland work and teach wetlands. But all of a sudden, this new farm bill came along, and there were new programs. So there was the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or they call it EQIP, which many of the farmers and ranchers here in Hawaii still use to this day. And they also had a wetlands reserve program. So it was all about wetlands and restoration and easements, perpetual easements given to landowners to set those aside preservation-wise forever, in perpetuity. And then a wildlife program. And as a new incoming biologist, they said, yeah, you get to run wetlands and wildlife. Go for it. And so that first year, we got, I think, $157,000 or something to spend on one or two projects. But in those 9 years, I built up the demand for wildlife projects to $2 million a year given to Hawaii for private landowners to do conservation work and mostly a lot of the work was on ranches and upper elevation, long generational places, and not as much because in Hawaii there's quite a bit of leased farming land, so the titles aren't very long term or a longer term contract or agreement. At any rate, so yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I got to meet so many people in Hawaii and see so many places, helicoptering into, Mount Eke on Maui and, Hana Ranch, but all over Hawaii. I got to be able to see and help people do some conservation work. A lot of invasive species control, a lot of water quality kind of planting kinds of ideas, planting back koa forests. It was great fun. It was great fun.
This begs two questions. The first is a political one. So, what kind of political acumen did you have to have in order to increase your funding? That's part of this question. And the other part of the question is, how would you define a wetland? Because I know you've written a book about it. And I'm going to talk to you about that in just a moment also. So
Yeah.
maybe let's begin with how would you define a wetland? And then second of all, how did you manage to do all these things within the political atmosphere of Hawaii?
So for a wetland, wetlands are wet lands, right? So hydrology means everything, and it could be surface or groundwater for a long enough period of time to, number one, change the soil, and then number two, change the plant. So it's the three things. It's water, soils, and vegetation, and all combine to make those areas. And in Hawaii, it is truly remarkable what we have. We have bogs at the top, like Mount Eke, I was telling you about. There are bogs, the Alakai Swamp, 450 inches of rainfall a year, right? Is a wonderful bog. The wettest place on earth is actually the Alakai Swamp. And then you have other kind of more intermittent systems, the playas on Molokai. You've got the coastal wetlands, which can be influenced by saltwater, marine, and others. And so it's very complex, actually. Wetlands are really complicated, but they're very important, and they serve as many have called them the kidneys, of our nature, and because they help with all sorts of things like water quality, and they're holding back floodwaters. They do storm surge, importance, function. So wetlands are really incredibly important. And here in Hawaii, we have a diversity of them, not just the coastal ones.
Well, so if you were in this position for 9 years, it means you had to have at least two governors involved because of their term limits. But so, who did you work with in our state, and did you also have to work nationally with our senators from Hawaii? And who did you work with in order to get this done?
So the Farm Bill is really national in nature. And so it really was up to the headquarters, the national people to get that done. And I want to be, one thing that was really important, I think, and the reason for the success of the Natural Resources Conservation Service is that we didn't have any politics. There were no politics. It was all about conservation work and about spreading the word on what you can do. And not only just, so farmers would get into this because it also was helping them sustain their properties and sustain their farms and their ranches. And so the conservation was also a sustainable thing for them. And so we really didn't, and I would never ask a question politically when I was out in the field with anybody, because these are budding conservationists it was my mind. People who are really interested in Hawaii, interested in Hawaii culture, interested in Hawaii native plants and animals, and water, of course, which is essential, fresh water. So all of those things just combined together to make it a kind of, that just wasn't a part of our conversations.
That's, God bless you, because, things have become so political these days that that's a nice way to describe it. And many professors I work with wouldn't get involved with even the politics of the university because they really were focused on their field, et cetera, et cetera. But okay, so let's make this transition now to Washington. So, what did you do
Yeah.
in Washington? And that's the first
Okay.
question. And the second question is, tell us about that New England region, because that sounds like a very interesting job.
Totally cool. So I first went over, to kind of get higher grades so I could make that national biologist GS-15 job. So they got me involved in doing internal auditing. And it was internal auditing of the agency before OIG or GAO came into town, into the states and into our business, and to try to get things resolved. If there were some issues of whether conservation planning wasn't being done well, or whether or not there were some, financial issues going on, that we got to clean up our own business before it gets out, basically, and helping and doing some more training and that kind of thing across the nation. So I did that for a couple of years. I was the national biologist also for a few years, and in that job, it was very interesting because there's a state biologist like I was in Hawaii of all the 52 entities. And so I got to lead all of those crazy feral cats, basically. So it was a lot of fun. And we did a lot of good work too, in terms of making sure that conservation practices that we expound and pay for are scientifically have integrity, right? So that was the big job there. And then I was asked to be, I got into a leadership program at American University, a USDA program for senior executives. And I got my senior exec, and then I got the job of heading science department. So I headed the Ecological Sciences Division of all of USDA, which is about 11,000 people, about 3,300 field offices. So we're spread throughout. Almost every county in the nation has a field office where people are doing this conservation work. And so that was a lot of fun. And I think with that was, I started getting into thinking, okay, I can't be doing this project by project too much anymore. What I really need to do is make sure that the right people are hired and recruited. And so I spent a lot of time hiring really good people in leadership positions, not only as a head of science, but also as a regional conservationist of the Northeast. Now, I'll transition on to that. And it was basically, we had 4 regions: the West, the Central, the Southeast, and the Northeast. And so I was asked to supervise the Northeast, which was from Maine down to West Virginia, over to Ohio and Michigan. So those are 2 kind of outlier states, but there was really an interesting and diverse group to try to also, not really the feral cat analogy, but it was a very interesting, and the issues from every state were very different too. And I think my legacy there was really being able to hire 8 out of the 14 state conservationists and make it as diverse as possible, with the thought that diversity equals diversity of thought. When you hire diverse people, you've got different thoughts going on, and you've got, and always hire more, smarter than you by far, with different kinds of backgrounds too. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about that and making sure that happened. So yeah, it was from Chesapeake Bay issues, in terms of environmental issues, a lot of water quality work the states needed to do, like Michigan, all the upper lakes there too. We also did a lot of work. We started work on urban environments, and I think this was a new thing for the agency, was to have an urban initiative for rooftop gardens, for those for small farms and farms within cities, pollinator gardens, those kinds of things for local food. Knowing that a lot of the Northeast in particular had food deserts, although food deserts are around the whole country. But I think it was important for the agency to step in and start thinking about working on the urban landscape and helping people with those huge deserts that we have across the nation.
I'm going to ask you about one of my interests in New England, and that is fishing. And
Mm.
I'm curious if you ever came across, issues facing, preservation of fish, and not only fish but crabbing and lobster. So of course are famous in Maine. And what kind of issues came up in that New England area? Because for all of us who watch The Perfect Storm and see the kind of issues that face these hardworking, mostly working class New Englanders. I just wanted to get you as a seasoned environmentalist and in charge of that whole area. What kind of issues came up?
There were a lot of issues. I was thinking, I did a small stint in Maine also as their acting state con, and we were doing a lot of really good stream work, and it was stream restoration work of all the different culvert situations where you can't get the upstream flow of a lot of your salmon and other species it's really important, the migratory path. And so we spent a lot of money and time working with landowners to change culvert systems around so that migration of fish could happen. So I think that was really critical, and that still belongs on our plate of to do, I think, throughout the country, is and even here in Hawaii for small opu, is to help the migratory path of these fish. There was a lot of the Chesapeake Bay. All in all, I mean, it was huge work that needed to be done for the fisheries, for the clamming, for everything. And it being the largest estuary, definitely in the continent, but I'm not sure even it's one of the largest in the world, of, really important live ecosystem that needed a lot of work, needed a lot of help. So, yeah, I guess I could say those things. Yeah, those things are most important, I think.
We don't have much time left, but I did want to get to your book about wetlands in Hawaii. Tell us about it. I mean, what have you written about in this wonderful book, in this great book?
So it is a wonderful book, and we're about to do a second edition, I think. I'm working on a book for my mother. It's a biography of her art, and once that is done this next year, we're gonna start, on updating this puppy. You can't see it, but yes, it's Hawaii Wetland Field Guide, Ecological and Identification Guide to Wetlands and Wetland Plants of the Hawaiian Islands. And I worked on this with my husband, Christopher Puttick. He's a botanist. And then, so he worked with other botanists to describe 208 plants. So it's an identification, it's a guide for being in the field. So you can find everything in there. I did the whole ecology part. So I talked about what is a wetland, what's a soil, hydrology, what does Hawaii have in particular that make us unique in our wetland ecosystems? And then I talked about mitigation, about permitting. I talk about invasive species and the problems that we have with invasive species in our wetlands. Um, at any rate, it's a lovely little book, and it has I brought in a couple experts talk about the birds, the insects, and the fish, all in a part of that ecology chapter. And so it does need a little bit of updating, but for the most part, just a few plant and taxonomy. I don't know if you know much about science folks, but they like to split and lump and split and lump, and so they change names all the time. So some of the names of the plants are different now, and it does need to be probably updated just a smooth bit. But it brought me to the whole idea of what needs to happen in terms of restoration. And I'll just almost end on a couple notes about that. That on Kauai, there's the Mana Plain, which is by Barking Sands, kind of way on the west-hand side of Kauai. And it used to be about 1,600 acres of wetlands before the cane companies. And the cane companies ditched and drained, and did their cane operations there until about the late 80s, early 90s. And so they drained it to be about 200 acres, so 1,600 to 200 acres of loss of wetlands. And that most of those are now in like drainage ditches. There's a couple of neat projects going on that the state has, and I was able to get over there just here in November, just 3 months ago, to help. And we were ripping out, so there was plastic tubing every few feet for the cane company for irrigation, and it had to be ripped out of all these mud flats. And so we spent a lot of time with volunteers ripping out all of that big plastic waste for these really important for not only the endangered water birds that are there pretty permanently, but also migratory birds that come through. Very important plain, and really cool to be a part of that.
Well, that I think people should go out and buy your book. But before we leave today, I know that you recently took a trip to India. And my question to you is, how does an environmentalist, a specialist on wetlands, when you travel, what do you see? Because, we all, in our journeys, we see things based on our perspectives. And so I'm going to ask you that as our culminating question.
Oh, I appreciate that question, because first it was a little bit of a shock, but I think the biggest thing of my learning all along is always be observant. Really observe where you're at and what it looks like, and what kind of lessons that you can learn from everywhere that you go. And I'm a birder, I'm amateur, but so I always bring my book, bring my binocs, and go like our second day in India, we went to a park in Bangalore that had lots of wetland and pond areas and a ton of birds. So I already got like 23 species on my list that day. And of course, we had Rotarians, really helpful, birder types along, which was great. So observation and even documentation was always important to me. I think it was very clear that there's waste, litter problems absolutely galore. Cows running around eating plastics. The water quality of every water body is just abysmal. They have a lot of work to do, and yet it's this vibrant cultures of many cultures, and a vibrant history of just the architecture, and even the inner cities, going to the markets in Delhi, really remarkable places. And in our last day, we got to see some restoration work being done on a tiger reserve, and it was removing lantana, which we have here in Hawaii, as an invasive species and planting grasslands for tigers and elephants and that kind of thing. So much bigger species than what we have here, but really interesting to walk along with these fellows and see the kind of work that they're doing, the passion that they had for making it all work was really exciting. So there are lessons to be learned, I think. I mean, every time you go anywhere, I think that's what one should do. Even if it's in your own backyard, and you haven't been there for a while. There are things to glean and think about.
This is a good way to end. We have been talking to Terrell Erickson, environmentalist extraordinaire, and she ended with something we should all take note of is, learning life lessons and learning and listening to other people, especially about the environment in this segment. Thank you, Terrell Erickson. Thank you for talking about your book, and hopefully my audience will go and buy your book. This is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind, a product of ThinkTech Hawaii, run by that bench, Jay Fidel. Ahui ho.